Hi everyone, this is a presentation that will provide a broad overview about suicide and suicide-related stigma. Aims of this presentation: provide a background on suicide, talk about some warning signs and risk factors, talk about suicide stigma, consequences, how we can combat that stigma, and talk about my story and my own experiences of losing someone to suicide. So, some background about me: I'm coming at this presentation from a variety of lenses. I'm going to be in my 5th year of a clinical psychology program where I'm trained to be a clinical scientist. Clinical scientist is trained to conduct research and to use evidence based approaches to counteracting the burden of mental health problems. My research is focused on depression, suicide, and alleviating mental health stigma. I'm also coming at this presentation from the perspective of a therapist who has experience with many clients who struggle with suicidal tendencies, and coming from the perspective of someone with lived experience of losing someone to suicide, and also as somebody who has their own history of depression. So, before we go into stigma, let's begin by talking about the impact of suicide on society. So, suicide is actually the 10th leading cause of death in the United States. A lot of people, my friends and family, are not aware of that. And most relevant to people listening to this presentation, suicide is the third leading cause of death for people ages 25 to 34. About 45 to 48,000 deaths by suicide occur each year. That translates to about 130 suicides per day. With that said, even more suicide attempts occur each year. So about 25 times the amount of attempts occur in comparison to suicide-related death. So even though suicide is the 10th leading cause of death, even more people attempt suicide and are put through those stressors each year. And for every suicide that we have, it leaves behind an average of 6 suicide survivors. So, for instance, when my brother died by suicide, I have myself, my family, his friends, everybody that knew him has kind of been impacted by this tragedy, similar to an atomic bomb, and there's all this radiation now that's gone off, is one way that I explain it. So, other background about suicide: I think it's important to know what groups are most affected by suicide. I'm not going to go in depth with this. I just want to provide a broad overview and begin the conversation for getting people to ask, why might there be differences in the rates of suicide? So, when we do studies, we actually find that females are more likely to attempt suicide. However, men are more likely to die by suicide. And white males in 2019 actually accounted for 70% of suicide-related deaths. This is a question about, again, so females attempt more, but why do men die at higher rates? And one reason might be that men are more likely to use lethal means than women. So think about our culture surrounding maybe masculinity and what masculinity might promote. So it might promote this kind of mental health is a weakness mindset, where men might be less likely to speak up about their problems when they're experiencing them. Men might also be more likely to have access to lethal means, such as a gun, in our society. So those might be some explanations that we have for these gender differences. Suicide also affects all ages, and I want to let you know that about people who are the most affected by suicide from a rates perspective are people are older. That said, even though there are lower rates at the younger ages, we have to remember that suicide still is about the second or third leading cause of death for people ages 10 to 24 and 25 to 34. Suicide also affects all races and ethnicities. All this data that I've presented thus far has been made available by the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, so big thanks to them and shout to them. I know that this graph doesn't include all races and ethnicities, but as we see here, people who are white and people who are American Indian have relatively higher rates of suicide. Other demographic features. Um, uh, the Trevor Project is an organization that looks at suicide risk and suicide prevention in young LGBTQ individuals. And from research, we actually find that LGBT youth seriously contemplate suicide almost 3 times the rate of heterosexual youth. And they're at an even higher rate of attempting suicide. And we found in a national study that 40% of transgender adults report having made a suicide attempt, and 92% of those individuals report having attempted suicide before the age of 25. So, again, when we're thinking about different demographic groups and risk factors, we need to ask ourselves, why are these individuals attempting and having these ideations at such high rates? And it's not rocket science. We see that the groups that are more discriminated against and there's a lack of social acceptance for, those are the people who are probably also under more stress, receive less access to services, less help, etc. So this is a graph that shows suicide methods. As we see, firearms account for almost the majority of all suicides in the United States. In 2019, firearms accounted for 50% of all suicide deaths. Thus, knowing whether someone experiencing intense suicidal ideation and whether or not they have access to a firearm can inform the safety plan for that individual. Some other risk factors that I'm just going to gloss over, but if you guys are interested, you can visit some of the resources that I will leave at the end of the presentation. Mental and physical health problems increase the risk of suicide. Mental health problems might include depression, bipolar, borderline personality disorder, schizophrenia, substance use issues. A stressful or abusive environment can increase the risk for suicide. So maybe bullying at school, or losing a job, or having maybe a breakup occur in someone's life. Historical factors related to risk include whether or not somebody's previously attempted suicide before. A previous attempt is a big predictor of a future attempt. It does not mean that everybody who attempts once will predict. It just means that it's a higher chance that they will. Okay, so I want to emphasize that this is a broad overview of assessing suicide risk, and this is not an official training. So I want you to know that if somebody comes to you and they express that they have suicidal ideation, or you suspect that someone you know might have suicidal ideation, do not feel compelled to know all the answers. Honestly, if you show your compassion and love for someone going through a crisis and help them get connected to services, you've done well. You've done great. That said, if you're interested, here are kind of the 4 P's you can keep in mind when talking to someone about suicidal ideation. So the first P involves plan. Does somebody going through suicidal crisis have a plan to actually attempt suicide? Is their plan maybe to hang themselves with their belt, or access their firearm that's locked away? How detailed is this plan? Knowing whether or not someone has a past history of suicide attempts. Like I said before, more attempts means there's a higher chance that somebody will reattempt. They have that acquired risk, as we say, for attempting suicide. Similar with prior hospitalizations, it might be some proxy for how severe someone's mental health crisis is. Think about somebody's probability of dying. So again, do they have access to a gun in their home, or are they just having thoughts that their mean would be a gun, but they have no access to a gun? So somebody whose plan is to use a gun, and they have access to a gun, that's a lot higher chance that they can follow through with that plan than somebody who maybe is having thoughts about shooting themselves but doesn't have any way of getting one. And think about some preventative factors. Think about what's keeping somebody around. What is giving them that life that they think is worth sticking around for? This could be their family, their friends, maybe having a pet, maybe having some meaning and purpose in life. And what other barriers might get in the way of their plan? So knowing these different aspects can help somebody inform the risk of low, moderate to high for how likely someone is to attempt suicide. One myth I wanted to dispel while giving this presentation is that talking about suicide does not increase the risk of suicide. It can actually prevent suicide. At some point, people thought that talking about suicide would implant the idea and lead people to actually do it. Trust me, if that were true, then we would probably just tell them don't attempt suicide. And if we had that kind of power, then we would tell them please don't do that. But actually, talking about suicide can actually open up the conversation, promote awareness, and promote acceptance for having these conversations, and you can then help somebody get help that way. If you don't talk about a problem, you can't do anything about it. Okay, so I said I would talk about suicide and stigma. So stigma is a little bit more complicated than I think people give it credit for. That said, some basic knowledge of it, I think, and I hope that people will be able to identify how stigma presents itself moving forward. So when we talk about stigma, we usually talk about two different types of stigma, or at least that's what I'm going to focus on. The first is public stigma. So public stigma is this whole idea that there are negative stereotypes, labels, judgments, prejudice, and discrimination occurs amongst the public, the overall population. So for instance, there might be negative stereotypes that suicide is a weakness, or people who commit suicide are selfish, or people who commit suicide are crazy, or they're shameful, or suicide is sinful, or people attempt suicide in a vengeful fashion. So these are kind of negative stereotypes that might impact somebody's thoughts and emotions and treatment of people going through a suicidal crisis. As well, these types of beliefs might impact the extent that the public kind of cares or wants to have conversations about suicide. For instance, if the public as a whole viewed suicide as something that's shameful and weakness and selfish, they're going to be less likely to want to have conversations about it, or how to treat it, or putting resources towards preventing it. So these stereotypes, like I said, can lead to prejudice, which are judgments and emotional reactions based in beliefs. So again, if you think somebody is selfish for attempting suicide previously, maybe you have prejudice towards them and you have these negative judgments towards them. Discrimination might also occur. So discrimination kind of captures the actions based off of these beliefs. So does our society treat people who have attempted suicide or has suicidal thoughts differently? Do we discriminate against people in employment settings, or maybe we don't want to go on a date with them, or we don't want to hang out with them because they have a history of suicide? Do we reject individuals for talking about their suicidal ideation? These are different ways that this prejudice and discrimination presents. Prejudice also might present from an emotional standpoint. So within families, maybe people are embarrassed that somebody they know has a mental health problem, or somebody might feel guilty for having somebody that they know have suicidal ideation, something like that. So generally, public stigma is the combination of these stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. And this public stigma can actually lead to self-stigma, which can be really harmful for people struggling with suicidal ideation. So self-stigma is when people who are of the stigmatized group, is when those people internalize the stereotypes and they believe them, and then people then stigmatize themselves. So specifically, if somebody is suffering from suicidal ideation and they see things related to suicide being weak, selfish, crazy, and sinful, that person might self-stigmatize themselves and think to themselves, I'm crazy. It's all my fault. Or if I speak up about this, maybe I'll be seen as weak. Or maybe leadership will treat me differently. Maybe I can't have the career that I have. So when people self-stigmatize themselves due to the public stigma surrounding it, people are less likely to speak up and seek help for their suicidal ideation. Um, Self stigma might have the consequence of this why try effect. So if people are just going to think I'm crazy and I think I'm crazy and I don't think I can be helped and it's all my fault, why would I speak up about this? Why would I try to get better from it? So the whole idea and takeaway is that if we stigmatize suicide and mental illness, we will fail at preventing suicide and mental illness. Um, some other consequences that that stigma has is stigma makes people's self-esteem worse. It can actually increase depression, decrease somebody's hope for getting better, um, and it will also decrease the likelihood that someone will seek out knowledge or donate to organizations related to suicide. So now that we got a broad idea of what stigma is, how can we alleviate it? How can we get people to be more accepting rather than stigmatizing of suicidal ideation and mental health more broadly? Well, at the individual level, on your own, you can start to check your beliefs. So ask yourself, do I have any beliefs that interfere with my ability to help someone in crisis? Are my beliefs even accurate? So maybe if you know a friend who is feeling suicidal or depressed, and you catch yourself having the belief that, oh, this person is just overreacting to a situation, maybe you check yourself on that belief. Maybe think about it from that other person's perspective, or think about it, if I view this person as overreacting, is that going to be effective for me to help them in this situation? Another thing that you can do is adapt your language. These are small interventions, but over the course, they can have large impacts. So, using person first language for mental illness and suicide, and recognizing that mental illness and suicide don't solely define a person. So, rather than saying somebody is a schizophrenic or an alcoholic, talk about them as a person with schizophrenia or a person who has substance use issues. Don't calling somebody this suicidal freak or suicidal individual or whatever, saying somebody who is experiencing suicidal thoughts. Another thing at the individual level, which can't be emphasized enough, is just practice compassion, take suicide seriously, and provide validation. I know that at different points, people might think, oh, feeling suicidal or depressed is like the in thing. Everybody's feeling it, but they don't actually mean it. No, it is a real thing. And when somebody says that they're depressed or feeling like they don't want to live anymore, take that seriously. Don't ignore that. Don't avoid that. Start the conversation. At the broad level, we can also alleviate stigma through actions and advocacy. So, advocating for reasonable accommodations for people going through mental health problems. That could include allowing people to take off time when needed or if they're in crisis, providing access to services through community supports. So, providing them access to problem solving. Maybe, for instance, at a workplace, somebody is like an ombuds person to help somebody going through some mental health issues talk through it. Kind of this third party person. We can alleviate stigma through providing mental health education, and specifically education through contact with individuals. So we know that when people actually know somebody who's going through a mental health problem or has experienced suicidal ideation and they've told their story and gotten to know the person firsthand, that can be really effective at alleviating stigma. And also listening and learning from people with lived experience. And I'll get into this more. So, for people who have experienced suicidal thoughts or maybe attempted suicide and survived, there is this stigma and there is this idea that people might not feel accepted or people don't accept them. And so we can learn and listen to we can listen and learn from their experience on how to improve support for people going through crisis. So I recommend everybody watch this video. It's about it's a compelling interview with a suicide survivor, educating kids on his experience and maybe why he was thinking about taking his life. Oh,
Did you think about your family?
Don't want to play that. Another video I recommend is called "Do All Suicide Survivors Think the Same?" Highly recommend watching this to see different perspectives within people with lived experience on kind of their own experiences. And in research to help reduce self-stigma, there's something called, there's a 3-session group. I don't know if it's exactly 3 sessions, but there's an intervention called the Coming Out Proud program. And we know that when people disclose different aspects of their mental illness, they actually report feeling more empowered and have higher confidence to seek and achieve their individual goals. So people who are able and comfortable of coming out and being open, honest, and proud about who they are, or sharing their story with mental health problems or suicidal crises, that can be really helpful to alleviating that self-stigma. So in this program, people learn to consider the pros and cons of disclosing. So this presentation is not to encourage everybody who's going through a mental health crisis or has a history of suicide to talk about it, but just recognizing that there can be pros and cons of disclosing in different settings, and there's different ways to disclose. You don't need to share all the details of your life. You can only share what's comfortable to you, what you think might be most effective, and you can learn different ways to tell your story. So to help practice what I'm preaching here,